Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead as he looked out over his dry, cracked pasture. The sun was beating down mercilessly, just like it had for the past 3 months. Where green grass should have been growing, there was nothing but brown dirt and scattered weeds. His cattle stood huddled under the few remaining shade trees, looking as miserable as he felt. 15 years. That's how long he'd been working this ranch in the heart of Montana. 15 years of early mornings, backbreaking work, and dreams of building something lasting for his family. But lately those dreams felt more like nightmares. The drought had started slowly last spring. At first, Jake thought it was just a temporary dry spell. Montana weather was unpredictable, everyone knew that. But as weeks turned into months without any real rain, the reality began to sink in. His wells were running low, his pastures were dying, and his cattle were getting thinner by the day. Standing on his front porch that morning, Jake counted only 43 head of cattle scattered across what used to be lush grazing land. 2 years ago, he'd had over 100. He'd been forced to sell most of them at rock-bottom prices just to pay for feed and keep the remaining animals alive. Cattle prices had dropped so low that he was lucky if he broke even on each sale. The financial pressure was crushing. Every night, Jake sat at his kitchen table with a pile of bills spread out in front of him, trying to figure out which ones he could pay and which ones would have to wait another month. The feed store bill was 3 months overdue. The bank was sending letters about the ranch mortgage. And then there were the medical bills. His wife Linda had been fighting cancer for the past year. The treatments were working, thank God for that, but the cost was devastating. Even with insurance, the co-pays, medications, and trips to the specialist in Billings were bleeding them dry. Jake had already sold his best bull and his grandfather's vintage tractor to cover the expenses. Linda tried to hide her worry, but Jake could see it in her eyes. She'd catch him staring at the bills late at night and quietly suggest that maybe they should consider selling the ranch. The idea made Jake's stomach turn. This land had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original homestead with his own hands. His father had expanded it, turning it into a profitable operation that supported the whole family. Now, Jake was watching it all slip away. His 8-year-old daughter Lily was the only one who seemed unaffected by their troubles. Every morning, she'd bounce out of bed ready to help with the morning chores. She'd named every single animal on the ranch and treated them like pets rather than livestock. While Jake worried about feed costs and veterinary bills, Lily just saw friends who needed taking care of. "Daddy, why do you look so sad all the time?" She'd asked him just the week before. Jake had knelt down to her level, looking into those bright, curious eyes that reminded him so much of his own mother. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. Daddy's just thinking about grown-up stuff." "Is it about money?" Lily had asked with the directness that only children possess. Jake had been surprised by her insight. "What makes you think that?" "Because Mommy was crying when she was looking at those papers yesterday. And you keep selling our animals." The honesty in her voice had nearly broken his heart. Jake had pulled her into a hug, promising that everything would work out somehow. But privately, he wasn't sure how. That's when he'd heard about the livestock auction in town. The Hendricks family, who'd run cattle for 40 years, had finally gone under. They were liquidating everything: cattle, horses, equipment, even the old farm dog. Jake's neighbor had mentioned it casually, suggesting that there might be some deals to be had. Jake knew he couldn't afford to buy more cattle, but maybe there would be some used equipment he could pick up cheap. His hay mower had been making strange noises lately, and he couldn't afford to have it break down completely. Even if he found nothing useful, it would be good to get away from the ranch for a few hours and maybe run into some old friends. Linda had encouraged him to go. "You've been cooped up here for months," she'd said. "It'll do you good to get out and talk to people." So on that Saturday morning, Jake had cleaned up his best boots, put on his least faded shirt, and driven his aging pickup truck into town. The auction was being held at the county fairgrounds, and even from the parking lot, he could hear the auctioneer's rapid-fire chatter echoing across the yard. Walking through the gates, Jake was struck by how many familiar faces he saw. Half the ranchers in the county seemed to be there, all looking for bargains or just curious about what their neighbors, Lives were worth when reduced to lot numbers and bid prices. It was both sad and oddly comforting to realize that he wasn't the only one struggling. The auction had been going on for hours by the time Jake arrived. Prime cattle were going for decent prices, but nothing he could afford. He watched a beautiful Angus bull sell for more than he'd made in the past 3 months combined. Equipment was moving at reasonable prices, but most of it was either too expensive or too worn out to be worth buying. Jake was about to leave when he noticed people starting to gather around a small pen at the far end of the yard. The energy of the crowd had changed. Instead of the serious bidding atmosphere that had dominated the cattle sales, there was laughter and joking. Someone was shouting something about the bottom of the barrel. Curious, Jake made his way through the crowd to see what was causing the commotion. What he saw made his heart sink. In the center of the pen stood the most pitiful-looking donkey he'd ever seen. The poor animal was so thin that every rib was visible through its dull, matted coat. Its head hung low and it swayed slightly as if it could barely stand up. The auctioneer was having fun with the situation. "Now, folks, what am I bid for this fine specimen of, well, let's just call it livestock? This donkey comes with a guarantee. It's definitely still breathing, though for how much longer, I can't say." The crowd chuckled, but Jake didn't find it funny. Looking at that broken-down animal reminded him too much of how he felt about his own situation. Both of them had seen better days, and both were running out of options. "Do I hear $5? The auctioneer called out. "Come on, folks, $5 for a genuine, authentic donkey. Think of it as a conversation piece." Nobody raised their hand. The animal just stood there, seemingly unaware of the attention. It was drawing. Jake found himself studying the donkey more closely. Despite its terrible condition, there was something about the way it held itself that suggested dignity. It wasn't a quitter, it was just down on its luck. All right. The auctioneer continued with theatrical disappointment. "How about $1? Surely somebody needs a donkey for $1. Think of your kids, folks. Every kid wants a donkey, right?" Jake's hand moved before his brain could stop it. $1 was about all he had left in his wallet anyway, and somehow, looking at that struggling animal felt like looking in a mirror. Maybe they both deserved a second chance. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt for $1. Jake couldn't believe what he'd just done. Around him, people were chuckling and shaking their heads. Someone behind him muttered, "Well, there's a sucker born every minute." Another voice said, "Hope, he's got a good shovel for when that thing keels over." But Jake wasn't paying attention to the comments. He was looking at the donkey, and for just a moment, he could have sworn the animal looked back at him with what seemed like gratitude. It was probably his imagination, but something about that look made him feel like he'd done the right thing. Even if everyone else thought he was crazy, walking to the payment window, Jake handed over his last crumpled dollar bill to the clerk, who gave him a receipt and directions to where he could pick up his purchase. The whole transaction felt surreal. An hour ago, he'd come here hoping to find a piece of equipment that might help save his ranch. Now he was the proud owner of a donkey that looked like it might not survive the trip home. The loading area was behind the main auction barn, where a few workers were helping people load their purchases. Jake backed his trailer up to the small pen where the donkey waited. Up close, the animal looked even worse than it had from a distance. The donkey's ribs stuck out like the frame of an old umbrella. Its coat was a patchwork of gray and brown, matted with dirt and what looked like dried mud. There were sores on its legs where the skin had been rubbed raw, probably from poorly fitting equipment. Its hooves were overgrown and cracked, making it clear that nobody had taken proper care of this animal in a very long time. "You sure you want this one, mister?" asked Billy, one of the ranch hands helping with the loading. "This poor thing's been through the ringer?" The Hendricks family said they found it wandering on their back 40 about 6 months ago. Been trying to nurse it back to health, but between you and me, I don't think it's got much fight left. Jake nodded, though he was starting to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. "Yeah, I'm sure. How do we get it in the trailer?" Billy scratched his head. "Well, that's the tricky part. This donkey hasn't exactly been cooperative. It took 3 of us just to get it into this pen. Seems scared of everything and everyone." As if to prove his point, when Billy approached with a lead rope, the donkey backed away as far as the small pen would allow. Its ears flattened against its head, and its eyes showed the kind of fear that comes from being hurt too many times. "Easy there, boy," Jake said softly, stepping into the pen. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The donkey watched him warily, but something in Jake's voice seemed to calm it slightly. Jake had always been good with animals. Growing up on the ranch, his father had taught him that animals could sense your intentions. They know if you're scared, angry, or trying to trick them, his dad used to say, but they also know if you genuinely care. Moving slowly, Jake reached out his hand, letting the donkey sniff his fingers. The animal's nostrils flared as it caught his scent, and after a moment, it allowed Jake to touch its neck. The fur was rough and dirty, but underneath, Jake could feel the warmth of life still fighting to survive. "That's it," Jake murmured. "You're okay now? I know you've had a rough time, but things are going to get better." Billy watched in amazement as Jake gently slipped the lead rope around the donkey's neck. "Well, I'll be damned. That animal hasn't let anyone get that close in weeks." Getting the donkey into the trailer took patience. It was clearly frightened of the enclosed space, probably remembering bad experiences from its past. But Jake didn't rush. He stood at the trailer entrance, talking quietly while offering handfuls of hay he'd grabbed from a nearby bale. "Come on, friend, it's just a short ride to somewhere better. I promise you that." It took 20 minutes, but eventually the donkey stepped into the trailer. Jake secured the gate and checked to make sure there was plenty of ventilation. The drive home would only take 30 minutes, but he didn't want to take any chances. With an animal in such poor condition, the ride back to the ranch gave Jake time to think about what he'd just done. Linda was going to think he'd lost his mind. They could barely afford to feed the cattle they had, and now he was bringing home another mouth to feed. And not just any mouth, one that belonged to an animal that might not even survive the week, but as he drove through the familiar countryside, Jake found himself thinking about second chances. Everyone deserved one, didn't they? This donkey had clearly been through hard times, just like his own family. Maybe they could help each other somehow. When Jake pulled into his driveway, Linda was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She looked up and waved, then did a double take when she saw the trailer. Walking over with a curious expression, she peered through the trailer slats. "Jake, please tell me you didn't spend money we don't have on livestock," she said, though her voice was more concerned than angry. $1, Jake said quickly. "I spent $1. Linda's eyebrows shot up. $1 for a donkey? She looked more closely at the animal in the trailer, and her expression softened. "Oh my goodness, Jake, this poor thing looks half dead." "I know," Jake said. "I couldn't just leave it there. Everyone was laughing at it, and I couldn't walk away." Linda studied her husband's face. After 15 years of marriage, she could read him like a book. She saw the compassion in his eyes, the same kindness that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. Even when they were struggling, even when every dollar mattered, Jake couldn't ignore a creature in need. "Where are you planning to put it?" she asked. "The old stall in the barn. The one we haven't used since we sold the horses." Linda nodded slowly. "And feed? I'll figure something out. Maybe it doesn't eat much in its condition." Before Linda could respond, the screen door slammed and Lily came running across the yard. She'd heard the trailer and was excited to see what her father had brought home. "Daddy, did you buy a cow?" she called out, running toward them with her pigtails bouncing. "Not exactly, sweetheart," Jake said, lifting her up so she could see into the trailer. "I bought a donkey." Lily's eyes went wide with wonder. "A real donkey? Like in the stories?" "A real donkey," Jake confirmed. "But this one is sick, honey. It's going to need a lot of care to get better." Lily stared at the animal with the intense focus that only children can manage. The donkey, seeming to sense her attention, raised its head and looked back at her. For a moment, girl and donkey studied each other through the trailer slats. "What's its name?" Lily asked. Jake realized he hadn't even thought about a name. I don't know, sweetheart. It doesn't have one yet. Can I name it? Jake looked at Linda, who shrugged with a small smile. I suppose, what do you want to call it? Lily thought for a moment, still staring at the donkey. Lucky, she said finally. Because it's lucky that you found it, and now it's lucky that it gets to live with us. Lucky, Jake had to admit, it was a good name. Though, looking at the poor condition of the animal, he wasn't sure luck had much to do with its life so far. But maybe that was about to change. The afternoon sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, and Jake knew he needed to get the donkey settled before dark. With Linda and Lily watching, he carefully backed the trailer up to the barn and opened the gate. Lucky stepped out slowly, looking around at his new surroundings with cautious curiosity. The barn smelled of hay and old leather, familiar ranch smells that seemed to calm the donkey slightly. Jake led Lucky to the empty stall and removed the lead rope. The donkey immediately went to the corner farthest from the door and stood facing the wall, as if trying to make itself invisible. It's okay, Jake said softly. You're safe here. As he filled a water bucket and scattered some hay in the stall, Jake wondered what he'd gotten himself into. But looking at Lily's excited face and seeing the hope in Linda's eyes, he thought, maybe, just maybe, they were all exactly where they needed to be. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of his alarm at 5 o'clock, same as always. But as he pulled on his boots and headed toward the barn for morning chores, he remembered the new addition to his family. He wondered if Lucky had made it through the night. Walking into the barn, Jake was surprised to find Lily already there, sitting cross-legged in front of Lucky's stall. She was still in her pajamas, her hair messy from sleep, but she was wide awake and talking softly to the donkey. Good morning, Lucky, she was saying in her sweet 8-year-old voice. Did you sleep okay? I brought you some carrots from the kitchen. Mommy said it was okay. Jake stopped in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Lucky was standing in the same corner where he'd positioned himself the night before, but his ears were pricked forward, listening to Lily's voice. The donkey hadn't touched the hay Jake had left, and the water bucket looked untouched too. Morning, sweetheart, Jake said quietly. You're up early. Lily turned around with a big smile. I wanted to check on Lucky, but Daddy, I don't think he's eating. The hay is still there, and he won't take the carrots. Jake nodded, trying to hide his concern. He'd been afraid of this. Animals in Lucky's condition sometimes just gave up. They'd been hurt and neglected for so long that they stopped trying to survive. Sometimes it takes a while for animals to feel safe enough to eat, he explained to Lily. Lucky doesn't know us yet. He doesn't know that we're going to take care of him. But how do we show him? Lily asked, her forehead wrinkled with worry. Patience, Jake said, kneeling down beside his daughter. We just keep being kind to him, keep talking to him, and eventually he'll figure out that we're his friends. Over the next few days, Lily made Lucky her personal project. Every morning before school, she'd sit by his stall and talk to him while Jake did the morning chores. She'd tell Lucky about her dreams, about what she was going to learn in school that day, about her favorite books and movies. Linda worried that Lily was getting too attached to an animal that might not survive. Jake, she said one evening as they watched their daughter through the kitchen window, sitting by the barn reading a book out loud to Lucky, what if the donkey doesn't make it? Lily's going to be heartbroken. Jake understood his wife's concern, but he also saw something happening that gave him hope. Look at her, Linda. When's the last time you've seen her this happy? With everything that's been going on, your treatments, the money problems, me being stressed all the time, she's had a lot to worry about for a little kid. But now she has something to focus on that's just hers? Linda had to admit he had a point. The past year had been hard on all of them, but especially on Lily. Children pick up on stress even when parents try to hide it. Having Lucky to care for seemed to give Lily a sense of purpose. By the third day, Lucky still wasn't eating much, but he'd started drinking water. Jake considered this a small victory. On the fourth day, Lily discovered that Lucky would eat hay if she held it out to him in her small hands. It was like he trusted her more than he trusted the hay lying on the ground. Look, Daddy, Lily called excitedly when Jake came to check on them. Lucky ate 3 whole handfuls. Jake watched as his daughter carefully offered another handful of hay to the donkey. Lucky's movements were still slow and cautious, but there was definitely a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he finished the hay, Lucky actually took a step closer to Lily instead of backing away. Linda started joining them in the evenings after dinner. Despite her initial reservations, she found herself charmed by the gentle donkey and moved by her daughter's dedication. Linda was still weak from her cancer treatments, and sitting quietly with Lily and Lucky became a peaceful part of her day. "You know what I think?" Linda said one evening as they watched Lucky carefully accept apple slices from Lily's hand. "I think this donkey knows exactly what he's doing. He's figured out that Lily is his best bet for getting better." Jake had to agree. Lucky seemed to respond to Lily in a way he didn't respond to anyone else. When Jake or Linda approached the stall, Lucky would tolerate their presence but remain distant. With Lily, he was different. He'd lower his head toward her voice, and his ears would perk up when he heard her coming after a week. Lucky was eating regularly and had gained enough strength to move around his stall. His ribs were still visible, but his coat was starting to look less dull. Jake had managed to trim his overgrown hooves, which seemed to make walking easier for the donkey. The transformation wasn't just physical. Lucky was becoming more alert, more interested in what was happening around him. When other animals in the barnyard made noise, he'd lift his head to listen. When Jake was working nearby, Lucky would watch him with curious eyes, but it was with Lily that Lucky truly came alive. She'd started bringing her homework to the barn, doing it while sitting next to Lucky's stall. She'd read her assignments out loud, using Lucky as a practice audience for her book reports. "Lucky is a really good listener," Lily announced at dinner one night. "He never interrupts or tells me I'm reading too fast like Tommy Peterson does." Jake and Linda exchanged amused glances. Their daughter had always been social, but having Lucky as a constant, patient companion seemed to boost her confidence. In ways they hadn't expected, word about Lucky spread around their small community faster than Jake had anticipated. Their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stopped by one afternoon while Lily was at school. "Heard you got yourself a rescue donkey?" she said, peering into the barn. "My granddaughter wants to know if she can come see it sometime." Jake was surprised by the interest. "Sure, I guess. Though I should warn you, he's still pretty shy around strangers." "That's what makes it interesting," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Animals like that, the ones that have been through hard times, they've got stories to tell." "My granddaughter loves animals, but her parents won't let her have pets. Maybe spending time with your donkey would be good for both of them." More neighbors started dropping by over the following days. Some brought treats for Lucky: carrots, apples, sugar cubes. Others just wanted to see the donkey that had captured little Lily's heart. Jake found himself telling the story of the $1 auction bid over and over. The attention seemed to energize Lily even more. She loved showing off Lucky's progress to visitors, demonstrating how he would now come to the front of his stall. When she called his name, how he would gently take treats from her hand, how he would let her brush his coat. "He's getting so much better," she'd tell everyone who would listen. "Daddy says he's gained 20 pounds already. And look how shiny his fur is getting." But the most remarkable change was in Lucky's demeanor. The frightened, broken animal that Jake had brought home was slowly being replaced by a donkey with personality. Lucky had opinions about things. He preferred carrots to apples. He liked having his ears scratched but not his nose touched. He enjoyed Lily singing but would turn away when Jake tried to whistle. 3 weeks after Lucky's arrival, Jake was amazed to realize that the donkey was actually becoming part of their daily routine. Lily would rush home from school each day, change out of her school clothes, and head straight to the barn. She'd spend hours talking to Lucky, grooming him, or just sitting quietly together. Linda's doctor visits became easier too. Instead of worrying about leaving Lily with neighbors, they knew she'd be content spending time with Lucky until they returned. "I never thought I'd say this," Linda admitted to Jake one evening, "but I think bringing Lucky home might have been one of the best decisions you've ever made." Jake nodded, watching through the window as Lily sat in the pasture with Lucky grazing peacefully nearby. The donkey was still thin and had a long way to go before he'd be completely healthy, but he was clearly a different animal than the broken creature Jake had brought home. More than that, Lucky was bringing out something special in Lily. She was more responsible, more compassionate, and more confident than ever before. And in a year that had been full of uncertainty and worry, having something positive to focus on had been exactly what their family needed. 2 months had passed since Lucky arrived at the ranch, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had started as a $1 act of compassion had turned into something that changed the entire atmosphere of their struggling farm. Jake couldn't help but smile every morning when he walked into the barn. Instead of finding Lucky huddled in the corner, the donkey now stood near the front of his stall, ears perked up and waiting for his daily routine with Lily. The hollow, defeated look in Lucky's eyes had been replaced with bright alertness and what Jake could only describe as hope. The physical changes were remarkable. Lucky had gained almost 30 pounds, and his ribs no longer showed through his coat. His fur had grown thick and lustrous, a beautiful silver-gray color that Jake hadn't even realized was hidden under all that dirt and neglect. Lucky's hooves were healthy now, properly trimmed and strong. He moved with confidence instead of the painful, hesitant steps he'd taken when he first arrived. But the emotional transformation was even more impressive. Lucky had developed what Linda called personality plus. He'd figured out the family's daily schedule and had opinions about any changes to it. If Jake was late with morning chores, Lucky would let out a series of brays that could wake the whole county. If Lily didn't come straight to the barn after school, Lucky would pace his stall and call out until she appeared. The bond between Lily and Lucky had grown stronger every day. What had started as a little girl's determination to save a sick animal had evolved into a deep friendship that amazed everyone who saw it. Lucky would whinny softly when he heard Lily's voice, even from inside the house. When she appeared at the barn door, his whole demeanor would change, ears forward, head up. Sometimes even what looked like a smile. Lily had established a routine that worked for both of them. Every school day she'd rush home, change into her barn clothes, and spend at least 2 hours with Lucky before dinner. Weekends were even better, entire afternoons spent together in the pasture or barn. "Lucky is my best friend," Lily had announced at dinner one evening. "He never judges me or tells me I'm weird for liking books more than video games. And he's the best listener in the whole world." Linda and Jake had exchanged glances across the table. They knew their daughter was social and had friends at school. But there was something special about her relationship with Lucky. The donkey gave her a sense of responsibility and purpose that seemed to make her more confident in all areas of her life. The changes weren't just happening with Lucky and Lily. The whole ranch seemed more alive somehow. Neighbors had started making regular visits, often bringing their own children to meet the famous rescue donkey. Word had spread throughout their rural community about the little girl who'd saved a dying animal with nothing but love and determination. Mrs. Chun from the feed store had started giving Jake discounts on hay and grain. "That little girl of yours is doing something special," she'd say. "It's good for people to see that kindness still matters in this world." Old Pete, who lived on the neighboring ranch, had become a regular visitor. He'd show up most evenings around sunset, claiming he was just checking on things. But Jake knew he came to see Lucky. Pete had lost his own wife 2 years earlier, and seemed to find comfort in watching Lily and Lucky together. "Reminds me of when my Betty used to take care of our old Mare," Pete had confided to Jake one evening. "Some people just have a way with animals. Your little girl's got that gift." The attention from the community had an unexpected benefit. People started bringing things, not just treats for Lucky, but practical items for the ranch. Someone donated a new water trough. Another neighbor brought over extra fence posts he wasn't using. Mrs. Patterson from town showed up one Saturday with a truck full of hay bales. "My husband ordered too much," she'd claimed, though Jake suspected she was just being kind. "Can't let it go to waste." These small acts of generosity were making a real difference in Jake's ability to keep the ranch running. Every donation meant one less thing he had to scrape together money to buy. For the first time in months, Jake was starting to feel like maybe they could weather this rough patch. Lucky seemed to understand that he was the center of all this positive attention. He'd started showing off when visitors came around. If Lily asked him to shake hands, he'd lift his front hoof. If she told him to bow, he'd lower his head dramatically. These weren't tricks Jake had taught him, Lucky had apparently figured them out on his own. Watching Lily's reactions and learning what made her happy, the donkey's intelligence continued to surprise everyone. Lucky had learned to open the latch on his stall door, though he never wandered far from the barn. He seemed to understand that the barn was his safe space. He'd figured out how to turn on the water spigot in the barnyard by pressing it with his nose. Most impressively, he'd learned to recognize the sound of Lily's school bus and would start. Calling for her a full 5 minutes before she appeared, Jake found himself looking forward to his evening chores because it meant spending time with Lucky. The donkey had become his companion during the quiet work of feeding cattle and checking fence lines. Lucky would follow Jake around the property, sometimes helping by carrying tools in a small pack that Lily had convinced her parents to buy for him. He's not just a pet, Jake realized one evening, watching Lucky carefully navigate around a broken fence post that Jake hadn't even noticed yet. He's actually helpful. It's like having an extra ranch hand who happens to have 4 legs and a great attitude. Linda's health had been improving steadily, and she credited some of that improvement to the positive atmosphere Lucky had brought to their home. Her cancer treatments were going well, and having something uplifting to focus on had helped her maintain her spirits during the difficult days. "I think Lucky is healing all of us," she told Jake one night. "Not just physically, but emotionally, too. This family needed something to bring us together, and somehow a $1 donkey turned out to be exactly what we needed." The ranch's finances were still tight, but the stress level had decreased dramatically. Instead of feeling like they were barely hanging on, the family felt like they were building something together. Lucky had become a symbol of hope and resilience that reminded them all that sometimes the most broken things could become the most beautiful with enough love and patience. Local media had started taking notice, too. A reporter from the county newspaper had called asking to do a story about the miracle donkey and the little girl who'd saved him. Jake had agreed, thinking it might help other animals in need find homes. But more than any external recognition, what mattered most was what Jake saw every day in his daughter's eyes. Lily had always been a caring child, but caring for Lucky had taught her about responsibility, persistence, and the rewards of putting someone else's needs before your own. She'd learned that love wasn't just a feeling, it was work, daily. Work that you did whether you felt like it or not. As summer approached, Jake often found himself standing at the kitchen window in the evening, watching Lily and Lucky in the pasture. Sometimes they'd just stand together, Lily's small hand resting on Lucky's neck while they watched the sunset. Other times they'd play games that only they understood. In those quiet moments, Jake realized that buying Lucky hadn't just saved the donkey's life. In ways he was only beginning to understand, Lucky had saved theirs too. The ranch was still struggling, money was still tight, and Linda still had treatments ahead of her. But they were facing it all together now, with a strength and hope they hadn't had before, and it had all started with a $1 bid on a dying donkey that nobody else wanted. Spring in Montana could be unpredictable, but nothing had prepared Jake's family for what meteorologists were calling the storm of the decade. It started as just another weather report on the local news, something Jake might normally pay attention to for a day or two before moving on to other concerns, but this storm was different. 3 months after Lucky's arrival, when the donkey had fully settled into his new life and become an integral part of their daily routine, the Weather Service began issuing warnings that made Jake's stomach tighten with worry. A massive low-pressure system was moving in from the west, carrying with it the potential for severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, and heavy rainfall. "Folks, this is not your typical spring storm," the weatherman announced on Tuesday evening. "We're looking at a weather system that could drop 3 to 4 inches of rain in a very short period of time. That's flash flood territory, especially in areas that have been experiencing drought conditions." Jake looked up from his dinner, fork halfway to his mouth. Their ranch had been in drought for 2 years. The ground was so hard and dry that water would run off instead of soaking in. 3 inches of rain in a short time could be dangerous. Linda caught his expression. You're worried, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Jake admitted. Our drainage isn't great even in normal conditions. If we get that much rain all at once. He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he was thinking. The little creek that ran behind their property, dry for most of the past year, could become a raging river. Wednesday brought ominous clouds building on the horizon. The air felt heavy and still, the way it does before a big storm. Jake spent the day moving equipment to higher ground and making sure all the animals had access to shelter. Lucky seemed to sense something was coming too. The donkey was restless, pacing his stall and calling out more than usual. What's wrong with Lucky? Lily asked when she came home from school. He seems nervous. Animals can sense weather changes better than we can, Jake explained. He probably knows a storm is coming. Lily spent extra time with Lucky that afternoon, trying to calm him down. But the donkey remained agitated, his ears constantly swiveling as if listening for something only he could hear. Thursday morning dawned gray and heavy. The Weather Service had upgraded their warnings. The storm was intensifying and was expected to hit their area Friday evening. Jake made a trip to town to stock up on supplies, flashlights, batteries, canned food, and anything else they might need if the power went out. At the hardware store, he ran into several neighbors who were making similar preparations. This one's got me worried, said Bill Thompson, whose ranch bordered Jake's property to the south. My grandfather used to tell stories about a storm like this back in '52, said it changed the whole landscape, carved new channels where there used to be flat ground. The creek behind my place has been dry for months, Jake replied. But if we really get 4 inches of rain, that creek turns into a river real quick, Bill nodded grimly. You might want to think about moving anything valuable away from there. Driving home, Jake mentally cataloged everything near the creek. The barn was about 50 yards from the usual creek bed, built on slightly higher ground. It should be safe unless the flooding was really severe. But the thought nagged at him as he pulled into his driveway. Friday morning brought an eerie calm. The air was perfectly still, and the clouds hung low and dark like a heavy blanket. Jake could feel the pressure change in his ears. Even the cattle seemed nervous, clustering together and looking toward the sky. Linda had a doctor's appointment in town for her cancer treatment follow-up. It was an important appointment that had been scheduled weeks in advance, but Jake was reluctant to let her drive in the approaching storm. The appointment is at 2 o'clock, Linda said over breakfast. According to the weather report, the storm won't hit until evening. I'll be back long before then. I don't like it, Jake said. What if the storm comes in faster than they predicted? Jake, this appointment can't be rescheduled easily. Dr. Martinez is only in town 1 day a week. Besides, I feel fine. The treatments are working, and I want to hear what he has to say about my progress. Lily looked back and forth between her parents, sensing the tension. Can I go with Mommy? She asked. School, Linda said firmly. You're not missing school for a doctor's appointment. They compromised. Linda would go to her appointment but would call every hour to check in. If the storm looked like it was moving in faster than predicted, she'd head home immediately, even if it meant leaving the appointment early. Jake spent the morning doing final storm preparations. He checked all the animals, made sure the barn doors were securely latched, and moved his tools to higher ground. Lucky was more agitated than ever, barely touching his breakfast and constantly looking toward the western sky. Easy, boy, Jake murmured, running his hand along Lucky's neck. It's just a storm. You've been through worse than this. But Lucky didn't calm down. If anything, the donkey seemed to become more anxious as the morning progressed. Around noon, the first drops of rain began to fall. They were big, heavy drops that splattered on the dry ground and left dark circles in the dust. Within minutes, the drops became a steady drizzle. Linda called from town. I'm at the doctor's office now. Everything looks good so far. The doctor says my latest tests are very encouraging. That's great, honey, Jake said, though he was distracted by the rapidly darkening sky. How much longer will you be? Maybe another hour. Then I'll head straight home. Good, the rain's starting here and the wind is picking up. By 1 o'clock the drizzle had become steady rain. By 2 o'clock it was a downpour. Jake stood on his front porch, watching sheets of water sweep across his pastures. The rain was coming down so hard he could barely see the barn. His phone rang. It was Linda. Jake, I'm still at the doctor's office. They're running behind, and Dr. Martinez wants to do one more test. But I'm looking out the window here, and it's really coming down. Should I leave now? Jake looked at the wall of rain moving across his property. Yeah, I think you should. This is getting bad fast. Okay, I'm leaving right now. I should be home in 45 minutes. But 45 minutes turned into an hour, then an hour and a half. The rain was falling harder than Jake had ever seen. He tried calling Linda's cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Either the cell towers were having problems, or she was in a dead zone. By 4 o'clock, Jake was genuinely worried. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and water was starting to pool in areas of his property that had been bone dry that morning. The little creek behind the barn was starting to show signs of life. Just a trickle, but it was running water for the first time in months. Lily's school bus arrived on time, the driver carefully navigating the increasingly muddy roads. Lily ran from the bus to the house, soaked despite the short distance. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, shaking rain from her hair. "Still at the doctor's office," Jake said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "She'd be home soon." But as the afternoon wore on and the rain continued to intensify, Jake's concern grew. He tried calling Linda a dozen times with no success. The landline phones were still working, so he called the doctor's office. "Mrs. Anderson left here almost 2 hours ago," the receptionist told him. "She said she was heading straight home because of the storm." And that meant Linda was somewhere on the road between town and the ranch, probably stuck or dealing with flooding. Jake felt helpless. He couldn't leave Lily alone to go look for her mother, especially not in this weather. By 6 o'clock, what had started as heavy rain had become a deluge unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. Water was pouring off their roof in waterfalls. The yard had turned into a lake. And most alarming of all, the creek behind the barn was no longer a trickle. It was a flowing stream, and it was rising fast. "Daddy," Lily said, standing at the kitchen window with her face pressed against the glass, "I can't see Lucky's barn anymore. There's too much rain." Jake joined her at the window. She was right. The rain was so heavy that visibility was down to maybe 20 feet. Everything beyond that was just a gray wall of water. And somewhere out there, Linda was trying to make her way home through what had become the storm of the decade. By 7 o'clock, Jake was pacing the kitchen floor like a caged animal. The storm had been raging for hours, and there was still no sign of Linda. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick that it looked like someone was dumping buckets of water from the sky. Every few minutes, lightning would flash, followed by thunder that shook the windows of their old farmhouse. Lily sat at the kitchen table, trying to do her homework, but Jake could tell she was as worried as he was. She kept glancing toward the window and asking the same question every 10 minutes. "When is Mommy coming home?" "Soon, sweetheart," Jake would answer, but his voice sounded less convincing each time. The power had flickered several times, and Jake had already gathered flashlights and candles just in case. The phone lines were still working, but his calls to Linda's cell phone continued to go straight to voicemail. He tried calling the sheriff's office to ask about road conditions, but the line was busy every time. Around 7:30, Jake made a decision that he'd been putting off. "Lily, I need to check on the animals," he said, pulling on his rain jacket. "The storm is getting worse, and I want to make sure everyone's okay. Can I come with you?" Lily asked hopefully. "No way," Jake said firmly. "It's too dangerous out." "There, you stay inside where it's safe and warm. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Jake stepped out into what felt like stepping into a river. The rain hit him with such force that he could barely keep his eyes open. The wind was howling, bending the trees nearly in half. Water was everywhere, rushing down the driveway, pooling in the yard, overflowing from gutters that couldn't handle the volume. Fighting his way toward the barn, Jake was shocked by what he saw. The little creek that normally ran behind their property, when it ran at all, had transformed into something he barely recognized. What had been a dry creek bed that morning was now a rushing torrent of muddy water, at least 10 feet wide. And moving fast, the sound was terrifying. Instead of the gentle babbling of a normal creek, this was a roaring, angry sound like a freight train. Trees and debris were being swept along in the current. Jake watched in horror as what looked like. A section of someone's fence went racing past, but what really made his heart stop was the realization that the water was still rising fast. Jake splashed through ankle-deep water to reach the barn. Inside, the animals were clearly agitated. The cattle had crowded into the covered area, pressing against each other for comfort. Lucky was in his stall, but he was pacing frantically and calling out with loud, distressed brays. "Easy, boy," Jake called out, but Lucky didn't calm down. If anything, the donkey seemed more upset when he saw Jake. Jake quickly checked the other animals and made sure they all had access to food and water. The barn was on higher ground than the house, so even if the flooding got worse, the animals should be safe here. The building was solid, built by his grandfather to withstand Montana weather. As Jake turned to leave, Lucky let out a series of brays that were different from any sounds Jake had heard him make before. They were urgent, almost frantic. The donkey was looking toward the door and then back at Jake, as if he was trying to communicate something important. "I know, Lucky, it's a bad storm. But you're safe here," Jake said. But Lucky's agitation only increased, fighting his way back through the rain to the house. Jake was alarmed to see that the water in their yard had risen several inches just in the time he'd been gone. The storm drain by their driveway was completely overwhelmed, creating a small lake where their front lawn used to be. Inside, Lily looked up anxiously when he walked through the door, dripping water everywhere. "How's Lucky?" she asked immediately. "He's fine, but he's upset about the storm," Jake said, toweling off his hair. "All the animals are safe in the barn." What Jake didn't tell Lily was how worried he was becoming about the flooding. The creek was rising faster than he'd ever seen water rise before. If it kept up at this rate, it could threaten the barn and maybe even their house. 8 o'clock came and went with no word from Linda. Jake tried the sheriff's office again and finally got through. "Sheriff's Department?" a harried voice answered. "This is Jake Anderson out on Creek Road. My wife was supposed to be home hours ago from town, and I haven't heard from her. I'm worried she might be stuck somewhere. Mr. Anderson, we've got reports of flooding on just about every road in the county. We've got crews out there, but honestly, we're overwhelmed. What kind of car is your wife driving?" Jake gave them the details about Linda's blue Honda sedan and her planned route home. The dispatcher promised to add it to their list of people to look for, but warned that it might be hours before they could get to all the reports they were receiving. "Sir," the dispatcher added, "if your property is anywhere near a creek or stream, you might want to think about moving to higher ground. We're getting reports of flash flooding that's worse than anything we've seen in decades." As if to emphasize the point, just as Jake hung up the phone, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. It was a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from the ground itself. "What was that?" Lily whispered. Jake moved to the kitchen window and tried to peer out through the rain. Lightning flashed, and for just a moment he could see the creek. What he saw made his blood run cold. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a river, a wild, raging river that was at least 20 feet wide and moving with terrifying speed. Trees that had stood for decades were being uprooted and swept away like twigs. The water was dark brown, thick with mud and debris, and it was still rising. "Lily," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm, "I want you to pack a bag with some clothes and your important things, just in case we need to leave the house for a while." "Leave the house?" Lily's eyes went wide. "But what about Lucky? We can't leave Lucky." "Lucky is safe in the barn," Jake assured her. "The barn is on higher ground, but our house is closer to the creek, and if the water keeps rising, ... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Lily understood. She ran upstairs to pack her things while Jake gathered important documents. medications, and emergency supplies. By 8:30, Jake could hear water rushing past their house. Not just rain running off the roof, but actual flowing water, like they were living next to a river, which, he realized with growing alarm, they now were. The phone rang, making them both jump. Jake lunged for it, hoping it was Linda. Jake, it was Bill Thompson, their neighbor. Jake, you need to get out of there right now. I'm up on the hill behind my place and I can see your property. That creek has turned into a monster. It's already jumped its banks and it's heading straight for your house. What about the barn? Jake asked, his heart pounding. The barn looks okay for now, but Jake, I'm telling you, you need to get Lily and get to higher ground. This water is moving fast, and it's carrying everything with it. I just watched it take out the old bridge on Miller's property like it was made of matchsticks. Jake looked toward the stairs where Lily was packing. How much time do we have? Not much. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe less. The water's moving faster than I've ever seen. As if the storm had heard their conversation, lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the entire house. In that brief moment of illumination, Jake saw something that made his heart stop. Water was beginning to pool in their backyard, creeping steadily toward the house. The creek had officially overflowed its banks, and their property was starting to flood. Lily, Jake called up the stairs. We need to go now. But when Lily came running down the stairs with her backpack, she headed straight for the door leading to the barn. I have to get Lucky, she said, reaching for her rain jacket. No, Jake caught her arm. Lily, it's too dangerous. The barn is safe, but getting there isn't safe anymore. But Lucky will be scared. Lily protested, tears starting to mix with the fear in her eyes. He doesn't understand what's happening. Jake knelt down to his daughter's level, his hands on her shoulders. Listen to me, sweetheart. Lucky is smart, and he's in the safest place on our property. We have to trust that. He'll be okay. Right now, our job is to get ourselves to safety so that when this storm is over, we can take care of him. Lily looked toward the door, then back at her father. Jake could see the internal struggle on her face, her love for Lucky fighting against her trust in her father's judgment. Another flash of lightning revealed that the water in their yard was now ankle-deep and rising fast. They were running out of time to make a safe escape to higher ground. The decision was made for them when they heard a sound that chilled them both to the bone, Lucky's desperate braying, carrying across the storm-torn night, calling out for the little girl who had saved his life. The sound of Lucky's desperate calls cut through the storm like a knife through Jake's heart. But it was the look on Lily's face that nearly broke him. Her 8-year-old eyes filled with tears as she heard her beloved donkey crying out in fear. Daddy? He's calling for me, Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of wind and rain. Lucky is scared and he needs me. Jake felt torn in two. Every instinct as a father told him to get his daughter to safety immediately. But he could also hear the raw terror in Lucky's voice, and he knew how much that donkey meant to Lily. Sweetheart, we have to go to higher ground right now, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. The water is rising too fast. But as they stood there, arguing about what to do, the decision was taken out of their hands. Through the kitchen window, Jake watched in horror as a wall of muddy water came rushing around the side of their house. The creek had completely overflowed, and their escape route to higher ground was now cut off by rushing floodwater. Oh no, Jake breathed, grabbing Lily's hand. We waited too long. The water outside was now knee-deep and moving fast. Debris was floating past their windows, pieces of fence, tree branches, and things Jake couldn't even identify in the darkness. The current was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet, let alone an 8-year-old girl. Jake's mind raced through their options. The house was starting to flood, with water seeping under the doors and through cracks in the foundation. They needed to get to higher ground, but the only higher ground nearby was the barn, Jake said suddenly. We have to get to the barn. It wasn't ideal, but the barn sat on a small hill behind their property. If they could make it there, they'd be safe from the rising water, and Lily would be reunited with Lucky. But how do we get there? Lily asked, pressing her face against the window. There's so much water. Jake studied the route between the house and barn. The distance was about 50 yards, but it looked like 50 miles in the current conditions. The water was moving fast, and it was getting deeper by the minute. Floating debris made it even more dangerous. "We'll have to wade through it," Jake said, "but we stay together, no matter what. You hold on to my hand and don't let go for any reason." They put on their rain jackets and boots, though Jake knew they wouldn't help much. As they prepared to leave the house, Jake grabbed a rope from the garage and tied one end around his waist and the other around Lily's, giving them about 6 feet of connection. "If we get separated, this rope will keep us together," he explained. "And if you fall, I'll pull you up." Opening the door was like opening a floodgate. Water immediately rushed into their kitchen, and the force of the current outside was stronger than Jake had expected. The water was now thigh-deep on him, which meant it was almost waist-deep on Lily. "Hold on tight," Jake shouted over the roar of the storm. They stepped out into the flood, and immediately Jake realized how dangerous this was. The current tried to sweep them away, and the muddy water made it impossible to see where they were. Stepping, Jake had to fight for every step, using all his strength to keep them both upright. Lily was struggling. The water was too deep for her, and she was being lifted off her feet by the current. Jake picked her up and carried her, but that made it even harder for him to maintain his balance. Halfway to the barn, Jake's foot hit something underwater, and he stumbled. For a terrifying moment, both he and Lily went under the muddy water. Jake fought his way back to the surface, pulling Lily with him, both of them gasping and choking on the dirty water. "I can't do this," Lily cried, clinging to her father. "It's too scary." "Yes, you can," Jake said firmly, though he was scared. "Too. Lucky is waiting for us. He needs his best friend to be brave." Those words seemed to give Lily new strength. She nodded and held on tighter as Jake continued fighting through the flood toward the barn. When they finally reached the barn, Jake had never been so relieved to touch solid ground. The building sat on a small hill that put it just high enough to be out of the flood zone. Water was lapping at the bottom of the hill, but the barn itself was dry. Inside, Lucky was in a state of panic unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The donkey was kicking at his stall door, braying constantly, and pacing back and forth in the small space. When he saw Lily, he became even more agitated. "Lucky!" Lily called out, running to his stall. "We're here! We're safe!" But Lucky didn't calm down. If anything, seeing Lily seemed to make him more frantic. He was looking toward the back wall of the barn and making sounds that Jake had never heard before. Urgent, almost desperate calls. "What's wrong with him?" Lily asked, confused by Lucky's behavior. Jake looked around the barn, trying to figure out what was upsetting the donkey. Everything seemed fine. The animals were safe, the building was solid, and they were out of the flood zone. But Lucky continued. His agitated behavior, alternating between looking at Lily and looking at the back wall of the barn. He was pawing at the ground and making those strange, urgent sounds. "It's like he's trying to tell us something," Lily said. Then Jake heard it, a sound that made his blood turn cold. It was the sound of rushing water, but it was coming from the wrong direction. Instead of hearing the flood in front of the barn, he was hearing water behind it. "Oh no," Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He ran to the back of the barn and looked out through a small window. What he saw made his heart stop. The flood wasn't just coming from the creek in front of their property. Heavy rains in the hills above them had created runoff that was flowing down behind the barn too. They were about to be surrounded by water on all sides. Lucky had sensed it before they had. Somehow, the donkey knew that their supposed safe haven was about to become a trap. "Lily," Jake called out, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "We have a problem." But before he could explain, water started seeping through cracks in the barn's foundation. It was just a trickle at first, but Jake knew it would get worse quickly. Lucky's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. The donkey wasn't just scared, he was trying to warn them. And now he was doing something that amazed. Jake. Lucky had positioned himself at the back wall of the barn and was kicking it with his hind legs. But he wasn't kicking randomly. He was kicking at a specific spot over and over with deliberate force. "Daddy, look!" Lily pointed at where Lucky was kicking. "The boards are getting loose." Jake looked closer and realized that Lucky was targeting the weakest part of the back wall, an area where the old boards had started to rot and weren't attached as securely as the rest. The brilliant donkey was trying to create an escape route. "Lucky, you're a genius," Jake breathed. Immediately understanding what they needed to do, Jake joined Lucky in attacking the wall. Using a crowbar he found hanging on a hook, together, man and donkey worked to break through the old boards. Lucky would kick, then step aside so Jake could pry at the loosened boards with the crowbar. Water was now ankle-deep inside the barn and rising fast. They were running out of time. "Come on, Lucky," Jake grunted, pulling at a stubborn board. "Help me." Out here, Lucky seemed to understand exactly what was needed. The donkey positioned himself and gave the wall one more powerful kick. This time, 3 boards broke free, creating an opening just big enough for a person to squeeze through, but the opening was too high for Lily to reach easily, and Jake couldn't lift her up to it while standing in rising water. That's when Lucky did something that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. The donkey moved to position himself directly under the opening, then looked back at Lily with an expression that seemed to say, "Climb on?" "He wants me to get on his back," Lily said, her eyes wide with understanding. "Do it," Jake said urgently. The water was now knee-deep in the barn. "Climb on Lucky's back and go through that opening." Lily had ridden Lucky many times during his recovery, so she knew how to mount him safely. But this time felt different. This time, Lucky was offering himself as her salvation. As Lily climbed onto Lucky's back, the donkey stood perfectly still, as steady as a rock despite the chaos around them. When she was secure, Lucky carefully moved closer to the wall, positioning himself so Lily could easily reach the opening. "Go through, sweetheart," Jake called out. "I'm right behind you." Lily squeezed through the opening and found herself on higher ground behind the barn. Jake quickly followed, pulling himself through just as the water inside the barn reached dangerous levels. But they weren't safe yet. They were still surrounded by rushing water, and the rain continued to pour down. Worse, Lucky was still inside the flooding barn. "Lucky!" Lily screamed. "Come on, Lucky!" The opening they'd created was big enough for a person, but too small for a donkey. Lucky was trapped inside with rapidly rising water. Jake looked around desperately for something to help make the opening bigger. That's when Lucky began kicking at the wall again, this time from the inside. The donkey was trying to enlarge the opening himself. "Help him, Daddy!" Lily cried. "We have to help Lucky." Working from the outside, Jake used the crowbar to break away more boards while Lucky kicked from the inside. It was slow, dangerous work with water rising around Lucky's legs. Finally, they managed to create an opening large enough for Lucky to squeeze through. The donkey didn't hesitate. He pushed his way through the opening and onto the higher ground where Jake and Lily waited. Standing on the small hill behind the barn, soaked to the bone and shivering in the cold rain, Jake held Lily close while Lucky stood protectively beside them. The storm was still raging, but they were finally safe on ground high enough to be out of reach of the floodwaters. "We made it," Jake whispered, hardly believing they'd all survived. "We actually made it." Lucky was breathing hard from their escape, but the donkey seemed calmer now that they were all together on higher ground. He kept close to Lily, occasionally nuzzling her shoulder as if checking to make sure she was really okay. "Lucky saved." "U.S.?" Lily said, her voice filled with awe despite her chattering teeth. "He knew the water was coming before we did." "He's a hero, Daddy," Jake nodded, still amazed by what he'd witnessed. The intelligence Lucky had shown, the way he'd deliberately kicked at the weakest part of the wall, how he'd positioned himself to help Lily escape, it was unlike anything Jake had ever seen from any animal. They huddled together on that hill for what felt like hours, watching the floodwaters rage below them. Jake's house was now completely surrounded by water, and he could see furniture and belongings floating past the windows. Years of hard work and memories were being washed away, but he felt grateful instead of devastated. His family was safe. That's all that mattered. The storm finally began to weaken around midnight. The lightning became less frequent, the thunder more distant, and the rain gradually changed from a downpour to a steady drizzle. Most importantly, Jake could see that The water had stopped rising. "I think the worst is over," he told Lily, who had fallen asleep leaning against Lucky's warm side. The donkey had been standing perfectly still for hours, serving as a living windbreak for the little girl. As dawn approached, Jake could finally see the full extent of the damage. The landscape looked completely different. The little creek that normally ran behind their property had carved a new channel that was 3 times wider than before. Trees that had stood for decades were gone, uprooted, and carried away by the flood. The road to their house was washed out, leaving them stranded on their hill, but they were alive. And that was everything. Around 7 in the morning, Jake heard the sound he'd been praying for all night, a truck engine in the distance. Then he heard someone calling his name. Jake Anderson. "Are you out there?" It was Bill Thompson, their neighbor, along with what sounded like several other people. "We're here," Jake shouted back, waving his arms. "Behind the barn?" "We're okay." Within minutes, a rescue party appeared on the hillside across from them. Jake could see Bill, 2 sheriff's deputies, and several other neighbors with ropes and boats. "Thank God," one of the deputies called out. "We've been looking for you all night." "Is everyone okay?" "We're fine," Jake called back. "But we can't get down from here. The water's still too deep." "We'll get you," Bill shouted. "Just hold tight." It took another hour for the rescue team to safely get Jake, Lily, and Lucky down from their hill into dry ground. The deputies had to use a boat to cross the still swollen creek, then help them wade through the remaining floodwater. But the most emotional moment came when they reached the main road. There, sitting in a sheriff's department vehicle with a blanket around her shoulders, was Linda. "Mommy!" Lily screamed, running toward her mother despite Jake's calls to be careful. Linda jumped out of the car and caught Lily in a hug that seemed to last forever. Both of them were crying as Jake joined them, and for several minutes the little family just held each other without saying a word. "I was so scared," Linda finally said. "I got stuck in town when the roads flooded. The sheriff's department wouldn't let anyone drive out here until the water went down. I've been sitting in that car all night, not knowing if you were okay." "We're fine," Jake said, still hardly believing it himself. "But we almost weren't, if it hadn't been for Lucky. He told Linda the whole story while the rescue workers listened in amazement. How Lucky had sensed the danger before they did, how he'd helped break down the barn wall to create an escape route, how he'd served as Lily's ladder to safety. "That donkey saved our lives," Jake concluded. "I'm not exaggerating. Without Lucky, we would have been trapped in that barn when it flooded." One of the sheriff's deputies, a man named Roy who'd lived in the county his whole life, shook his head in wonder. "In 30 years of emergency response, I've never heard anything like that. Animals sometimes sense danger, sure, but what you're describing is problem-solving intelligence." News of their rescue spread quickly through their small community. By that afternoon, despite the storm damage and flooded roads, people started showing up to check on them and hear the story firsthand. Mrs. Henderson arrived with homemade soup and dry clothes. "I had to come see this miracle donkey for myself," she said, looking at Lucky with new respect. "My granddaughter is never going to believe this story." Old Pete showed up with a trailer full of hay. "Figure Lucky's earned some premium feed after what he did," Pete said gruffly, though Jake could see tears in the old man's eyes. The local newspaper reporter arrived the next day, followed by a photographer from the regional paper. Within a week, Lucky's story had appeared in newspapers across Montana, then picked up by national news outlets. "Donkey saves family in flash flood," read one headline. "From death's door to hero, the $1 rescue that saved lives," read another. But the media attention wasn't what mattered to Jake's family. What mattered was what Lucky had shown them about loyalty, intelligence, and the incredible bond that could exist between humans and animals. The insurance adjuster who came to assess their flood damage was amazed when he heard the story. "You know," he told Jake, "most people in your situation would be devastated by this kind of loss, but you seem almost grateful." "I am grateful," Jake replied without hesitation. 6 months ago, I spent my last dollar on a dying donkey that nobody else wanted. People thought I was crazy, but that donkey just saved my daughter's life. How do you put a price on that? The rebuilding process took months. The house needed major repairs, and they had to completely redesign their property's drainage to handle future floods. But the community came together to help in ways that amazed Jake. Neighbors donated materials, time, and labor. The local feed store gave them free supplies for their animals. It's like Lucky brought out the best in everyone. Linda observed one evening as they watched volunteers work on their new barn. The new barn was built even higher on the hill, and it included a special stall for Lucky with a window that looked out over the valley. Lily insisted on a plaque that read, "Lucky's Stall, Hero and Best Friend." But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Lucky himself. The experience seemed to have given the donkey even more confidence and intelligence. He learned new commands. Almost instantly, could open gates and doors, and seemed to understand complex instructions. Veterinarians and animal behaviorists came from universities to study Lucky's remarkable problem-solving abilities. They were amazed by his capacity for reasoning and planning ahead. This animal displays cognitive abilities that we rarely see even in the most intelligent dogs or horses. Dr. Patricia Williams from the State University told Jake, "What Lucky did during that flood required abstract thinking, planning, and tool use. It's extraordinary." More importantly to Jake's family, Lucky had become a local celebrity and inspiration. Schools brought children to meet him and hear his story. The county named him Animal Hero of the Year. A children's book was written about his rescue and heroic actions, but Lucky seemed most content during the quiet moments when Lily would sit with him in the evenings, brushing his coat and telling him about her day, or when the family would take walks together around their rebuilt property. 1 year after the flood, Jake stood in the same spot where he'd watched the floodwaters rage. Now, looking out over green pastures and a peaceful creek running in its new channel. Lucky grazed nearby while Lily played on a tire swing Jake had hung from an old oak tree that had somehow survived the storm. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Linda said, joining him at the fence. "Hard to believe how much has changed." Jake replied, "A year ago, we were barely hanging on. Now look at us." The ranch was thriving. The story of Lucky's heroism had brought positive attention that helped Jake's cattle business. Tourism had increased, with people wanting to visit the ranch where the miracle happened. Jake had started offering educational tours about animal intelligence and the human-animal bond, but more than the business success, the experience had changed. How the family viewed their relationships with animals and with each other. They'd learned about resilience, hope, and the incredible things that could happen when you showed kindness to a creature in need. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Linda said, watching Lucky lift his head to check on Lily as he did constantly. "What if that auctioneer had started the bidding at 50 cents instead of $1? What if someone else had bid on him? What if we'd never gone to that auction at all?" Jake smiled. "I don't think about the what-ifs anymore. I just think about how lucky we all are." As if he'd heard his name, Lucky looked over at them and let out a soft bray, not the desperate, frightened calls from the night of the flood, but the contented sound of a donkey who knew he was home, loved, and valued. $1 investment had returned something priceless.